Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion with world-renowned linguist, author, and MIT professor Noam Chomsky. Noam, thanks so much for coming. We are incredibly grateful to have you here. And we also have to thank the Palacký University on Olomouci for inviting Noam Chomsky to the Czech Republic. Tomorrow, Noam Chomsky will address the audience at 7 p.m. at the Metropole Cinema in Olomouci. So some of you may have another opportunity to see Noam again. And today, we will talk mainly about issues related to politics, but of course, you can ask other kinds of questions as well. And this debate will consist of two parts. In the first part, I will be asking Noam to talk about some issues, and then there will be a lot of space for questions from the audience. So it requires some cooperation from your side. Please make no long speeches, not more than 1 or 2 minutes. The more concise questions, the more enjoyable event is for all of us. And I might be quite tough on that. So, now it's also a great opportunity for me to present a book that has just been published. It's Czech translation of Noam Chomsky's political text, and it was published by the Charles University Publishing House, and it's called The Disident of the West. And it's a collection of Noam Chomsky's essays focused on many issues, such as the US foreign policy, the Cold War, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, anarchism, or the relationship between language and freedom. So, I would like to talk about some issues related to the book, and that of course means with politics. So Noam, nowadays you are probably the most well-known public intellectual and activist in the world. So my first question will be quite simple. How did you become politically active, or how did you become a political activist?
Well, I became, can you hear? Yeah. Well, I became politically active as a young child. I grew up in the Depression, 1930s. Some of my earliest childhood memories are people coming to the door, trying to sell rags, people who looked as if they were starving to death, homeless people in the streets, riding with my mother in a trolley car past textile factories where police were beating up women strikers outside. My family was mostly unemployed, working class, it was a lively political period. I was pretty quickly caught up in debates and discussions. I had an uncle who had a newsstand in New York. I used to work at the newsstand, listen to a lot of political discussions going on. By the time I was I was listening to, I couldn't understand it, but my parents would listen to Hitler speeches on the radio, and it was frightening, just not even understanding the words, but just hearing the tone and the crowd reaction and so on. And of course, fascism was expanding over Europe. I was actually writing about it as a child. First article I can remember, I can date very precisely. It was after the fall of Barcelona, so it would have been February 1939. And I don't remember the article, and I'm sure it was not a great classic. I hope it's disappeared. But it was essentially about the spread of fascism. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Toledo, Barcelona. And the question is where it's going to end, or is it going to end? Then I very quickly was caught up in, I was at that time what was called an active Zionist, but opposed to a Jewish state. Remember, that was part of the Zionist movement at the time, and interested in Arab-Jewish cooperation, working class cooperation. by the time I was about 10 or 11 years old, I was spending time at the anarchist bookstores in New York. There was a street, if any of you know New York, Union Square had the left wing, including the anarchist offices, and then Fourth Avenue going down to the south was lined with little bookstores, many of them run by emigres, some of them Spanish anarchists. I spent a lot of time there, picked up literature, talked to people, and it just went on from there, but there was never a first time.
Okay, and you were pretty politically active in the 1960s during the war in Vietnam. So what was the atmosphere like in the 1960s, and what did you expect from your political activism?
Well, the 1950s were a pretty quiet period. I was as politically active as it was possible to be then. There was very little organized political activity. It was very quiescent and subdued. There was fear of McCarthyism was greatly exaggerated, in my opinion, but it did keep things quiet and subdued. By 1960, things were beginning to change. The civil rights movement was beginning to take off in the South. In 1961, there was a little item in the New York Times in the back pages, maybe 20 lines, pointing out that Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, then president, had sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam under the pretense that they were South Vietnamese planes, but actually American pilots and American planes. There's about 3 lines, and that got me interested, and I immediately started looking into it, and very quickly began trying to give talks, lead discussions about the Vietnam War. We didn't know then what we know now. Now we know how severe the attack was. It was much more severe than that. Kennedy had also authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops and livestock, initiated plans to drive ultimately millions of people into concentration camps, urban slums. It was a major attack, but barely discussed. And it was extremely hard to elicit any interest in it. And the first talks I was giving were literally in people's living rooms or in a church with maybe 4 people or something like that. It took a long time for an activist movement to get started. Just to illustrate, I was living in Boston, which is maybe the most liberal city in the country, and our first effort to have an outdoor protest against the war was in October 1965. Older people may remember that was the first international day of protest against the war. By October 1965, South Vietnam had been practically destroyed. There were hundreds of thousands of American troops, and the bombing of North Vietnam was underway. And it seemed that it might be possible to have a public demonstration. There's an area in Boston which is kind of Hyde Park, essentially. It's a place where all public activities take place. So we organized a demonstration there, but it was physically broken up, violently broken up, including by students, incidentally. The only reason that I was supposed to be one of the speakers, but not a word could be heard. We escaped serious attacks only because there were a lot of state police around. And the liberal newspaper, the most liberal paper in the country, denounced the demonstrators. How dare you call for an end to the bombing of North Vietnam, that kind of thing. The next time there was a demonstration, we realized we couldn't have it in public, in the open area, so we had it in a church, March 1966. Church was attacked, same story. By 1967, it was changing. And by that time, the war was extraordinary. There were 500,000 American troops there, and the place was just being wiped out, and the bombing had expanded. to Laos and Cambodia, North Vietnam heavily bombed, but nothing like the South. And at that point, it became possible really to begin to organize a resistance movement. Actually, in 1965, together with an artist friend, I tried to start a national tax resistance movement. We didn't get very far, but we kept at it for about 10 years. By 66, there was a larger resistance movement beginning, support for people refusing to fight the war. Some deserters, some went to jail. By 1960, I assumed, I took for granted that we'd all end up in jail because we were explicitly violating, very openly, publicly, as public as we could, violating major laws. And indeed, my wife, we had 3 kids. My wife, who went back to school after 16 years to get a degree because we figured she'd have to support the children. And in 1968, in fact, I was up on trial. The trials were finally called off because of the Tet Offensive. January 68 shifted U.S. policy, and they called off the trials. But back in the early 60s, I assumed, I had enough political experience to know that once you get started, you're not going to stop. And it'll have to go on to the point of direct resistance, which will mean punitive actions. And there was a lot of, small-time jailing, civil disobedience, things like that. But it was pretty serious. And incidentally, it's kind of suppressed in the media and in the historical studies, but the anti-war movement turned out to be extremely successful. If you want to know how successful it was, read the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, which, as you know, are an internal government historical record of the Vietnam War, released by Dan Ellsberg, who's a friend. In fact, I helped distribute the papers. But they end in mid-1968. And in right after the Tet Offensive, January 1968, there was an uprising in South Vietnam, which is the most incredible popular uprising in history, I think. South Vietnam was saturated with American troops, over 500,000. There was a Saigon army, kind of a mercenary army, hundreds, maybe 700,000-800,000 people. Every village was infiltrated and controlled. The uprising was not a word leaked out about the uprising. It was sudden, organized, total surprise to the occupiers and to the Saigon authorities, an astonishing feat of popular resistance. I actually don't know of any example like it. And it had to be put down with extreme violence. Actually, the guerrillas got into the American embassy, even took over towns. Towns had to be destroyed and so on. And that shook the U.S. establishment. I mean, it showed that the expectations of a victory by just grinding them down to dust were much too ambitious. They weren't going to succeed easily. The President Johnson wanted to send a couple 100,000 more troops. The military were opposed. They were opposed, we learned from the Pentagon Papers, because they thought that if they sent more troops, they would be short of troops within the United States to suppress and control uprisings within the United States. They expected mass popular uprisings among young people, women, minorities, and they said, we're going to need the troops to put them down, so we don't want to send them to Vietnam, and they didn't send them. That's an indication of how effective the anti-war movement was. And after that, unfortunately, came another 7 years of war, supposedly winding down, but a horror story, and the protests continued. But all in all, it was a major popular phenomenon, which was one of a number of things that were happening in the 1960s. 1960s were, it's called the intellectual elite and history and so on calls it the time of troubles. Actually, what it was a time of civilizing American society, and in fact much of the world. A lot of things changed. The beginnings of there was the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the beginnings of the women's movement, which really took off in the 1970s, bare beginnings of an environmental movement. Lots of major changes took place. A lot of them are lasting. Naturally, a period of regression and repression followed. Power doesn't give up its ability to suppress easily. So yes, this period of repression, but it's maintained, and it's in fact grown. I described what it was like at the beginning of the Vietnam War. It took years before you could get any protest going. Move forward to the invasion of Iraq, March 2003. That's the first time in the history of Western imperialism that there were massive protests before the war was officially launched. Never been anything like that before. And that's a reflection of the growth of the opposition to aggression on the part of the population. Now, the official story is that the protests weren't effective because the war went on. And unfortunately, a lot of the left believes that, but it's not true. If you take a look you compare the Iraq War to the Vietnam War, you can see that horrible as the Iraq War was, and it was horrendous, President Bush never even dreamed of carrying out the actions that John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson carried out without a second thought. They just couldn't conceivably do anything like that. They had to fight a much more limited war, which was horrible enough, but it could have been a lot worse. No massive chemical warfare, no saturation bombing with B-52s. All the things that Kennedy and Johnson did were impossible just because of the popular opposition. And there are important lessons in all of this. The power systems would like you to think that popular opposition can't achieve anything. You look at the record, it's simply not true. It can achieve quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. And in the 1960s, you were a world-renowned linguist as well. You were part of the academia. And I would like to ask you, you challenged with your political activism some notion of objective scholarship or politically neutral scholarship. So could you comment on that a little, or how was your activism received in the US academia?
Well, I mean, there is a kind of a postmodern doctrine that questions the possibility of objectivity and finding truth and so on. I think that's a serious mistake. Of course, any work you do in any field, physics, anything else, is going to be carried out within some sort of a framework of assumptions. There's no way to carry out inquiry otherwise. But you can become conscious of the assumptions and allow them to be challenged. And in serious fields, that in fact happens. It's happened in the hard sciences, happened in linguistics repeatedly. If you mean by objectivity no point of view whatsoever, of course that's impossible. You have to have a point of view, a framework to simply give some structure to the kind of inquiries you're carrying out. But that's not a debilitating problem in itself, because the framework itself is always up to challenge. Now that can be done in areas of human concern, political study of political affairs, international relations, and so on. It's much harder there because there's a lot of pressures not to challenge assumptions, strong pressures to try to prevent breaking discipline. And this goes way back through history. You take a look at the history of intellectuals, back to classical Greece and biblical record and all the way through to the present, the great mass of intellectuals have almost always been supporters of power, people who did not question authority, who obeyed, who maintained the dogmas, didn't question them, and so on. And they're the ones who are praised in their own societies. There's almost always a fringe of dissidents, and they're almost always treated harshly. So it was, in classical Greece, it was the man who was corrupting the youth who had to drink the hemlock. In the biblical record, it was the prophets, or not prophets, but they were basically critical intellectuals. They're the ones who were driven into the desert and imprisoned. The ones who were praised at the time are the ones who centuries later were condemned as the false prophets. Same in Greece, the term intellectual entered standard Western discourse with the Dreyfus trial. And now the Dreyfusards are praised. They weren't at the time. They were vilified, denounced. Émile Zola had to flee France. The distinguished intellectuals, the immortals of the Académie Française were bitterly condemned the Dreyfusards for daring to challenge state authority, to criticize the military, and so on. And that's the pattern all the way through. How harshly dissidents are treated depends on the nature of the society. So, for example, in Czechoslovakia, under the communists, Václav Havel was in jail for a couple of years. His counterparts in U.S. domains simply had their heads blown off by U.S. trained and armed security forces. It depends on the nature of the society. But it's always some sort of harsh treatment. And going back to the possibility of objectivity and scholarship and inquiry related to human affairs, that's the situation you face. You can do it. There'll probably be punishment of one sort or another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of the most important texts for me is a text called Cold War, Facts and Fancy. It's about Cold War, and in the Czech Republic we have some kind of mainstream narrative of the Cold War, and the Cold War is considered as the fight between the historical good and evil in general. It's about the defender of freedom, the United States, and the so-called nightmare, the Soviet Union. And now, in 2014, we also have a lot of debates regarding the role of Russia because of the crisis in Ukraine. And this put the Reagan narrative, or the narrative about good and evil, on the table again. But your story of the Cold War is different. Could you tell us how?
Well, if you want to understand the Cold, there's many ways to evaluate that narrative. And forgetting good and evil, there's a way to evaluate the claim that the West fought the Cold War in defense against Russia. I mean, that's the doctrine. The West was defending itself against the evil Russia, the evil empire, Russia. Monolithic and ruthless conspiracy, as John F. Kennedy called it. We had to defend ourselves against it. There are very easy ways to check that, very simple ways. One question you can ask, an obvious question, is what happened when the Cold War ended? What happened when Russia and the Soviet Union collapsed? Simple question. Answer is very simple. Everything went on exactly as before, but with new pretexts. So, for example, a couple of weeks after the Berlin Wall fell, the United States invaded Panama. Well, that's routine. Bombed the slums, bombed the working class areas, killed probably a couple thousand people, instituted basically put in a harsh, brutal client regime, a regime of drug peddlers, in fact, and bankers. That's all routine. The press loved it and applauded it and so on. Latin America was bitterly condemned. Nobody cared about that. The United States had to veto a unanimous Security Council resolution condemning the crimes of American troops. Nobody cared about that. All completely routine. One change. For the first time, it wasn't blamed on the Russian threat, because there was no Russian threat. Instead, they made up a pretext so ludicrous that they collapse on a moment's investigation. But that was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, right after the Berlin Wall fell, and here Czechoslovakia is implicated, El Salvador, which was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid outside of Israel and Egypt, they're a separate category, was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and had the worst human rights record. That's a standard correlation, goes on regularly. The high command of the Salvadoran army, which is in close contact with the United States, which ran the country, ordered a brigade, a brutal, harsh brigade, Atlacatl Brigade, which had killed thousands of people already. It ordered them to invade the university, the Jesuit university, and murder the six leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, and anyone else who might be around, so there'd be no witnesses. So they blew their heads off and killed their housekeeper and daughter. This brigade had just returned from advanced training at the John F. Kennedy Counterinsurgency School in North Carolina to upgrade their skills. Well, that's what happens to dissidents in countries like in American client states. Something interesting happened right after it. Václav Havel came to the United States right after it, gave a talk before a joint session of Congress, received a standing ovation when he praised the United States as the defenders of freedom, as just illustrated by their murdering half a dozen of his counterparts in a client state. And he's lauded for that in the United States. In fact, they're just learned today they're putting up a monument to him in the Congress because of this wonderful contribution, calling us the defenders of freedom, when we've just been carrying out the horrendous atrocities ending with the murder of 6 leading intellectuals. Well, that's the Cold War. It continues. Right after the Cold War, and this gets to the present, Mikhail Gorbachev made an astonishing concession, quite astonishing. He agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join a hostile military alliance, NATO. You just take a look at the history of the past century. I don't have to go into it, you know it very well. To agree to allow a unified Germany to enter a hostile military alliance is tremendous concession for Russia. Now, there was a quid pro quo. The U.S. President Bush, his Secretary of State, James Baker, promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase. That meant East Germany. They would stay in West Germany. That was the agreement. Immediately, NATO moved to East Germany. Gorbachev complained, naturally, but he was informed by the U.S. government that the promise was only a verbal promise. It wasn't put on paper. And if he's naive enough to accept a gentleman's agreement from the United States, that's his problem. Then Bill Clinton was elected and moved NATO even further to the east. Now it surrounds, you know, it always was on Russia's borders, like Turkey's on Russia's borders, but now it's surrounded, almost completely surrounded Russia. Well, that comes up to the present, to the Ukraine. Right now, the US and Europe are pressing to try to integrate Ukraine into the Western system, but also probably into NATO. At least that's what they're talking about. From the Russian point of view, that's a pretty severe security threat. I mean, it's as if the Warsaw Pact was integrating Canada and Mexico into the Warsaw Pact and putting major military forces there. That would be the analog. Of course, nobody uses that analog in the West because it's taken for granted. There's a dogma in the West, an unchallengeable dogma, that the United States owns the world. And if anyone tries to be independent, they're the ones who are causing the problem. That's the whole history of the Cold War, in fact. You take a look at the actual events of the Cold War, just to continue with briefly this observation about the end of the Cold War. What the end of the Cold War shows is that things went on exactly as before, new pretexts. That's enough to tell you right off that the standard narrative is a fraud. But there's much more than that. There are also the events of the Cold War. What were the events of the Cold War? Well, they're pretty straightforward. The Cold War was a kind of a tacit compact between the two superpowers, the huge superpower, the United States, the smaller superpower, Russia. They basically agreed that they would not interfere much in the other superpowers' domains. For Russia, the domains were Eastern Europe, the traditional invasion route into Russia. For the United States, the domain was the rest of the world, literally. And so there was no great interference, none at all, in fact, when Russia invaded Hungary, or in '68 in Czechoslovakia, or Poland in '81, and so on, nothing much. Nor was there any Russian intervention when the US interfered all over the world. Major wars, major invasions, aggression, and instituting brutal dictatorships, military dictatorships, massive atrocities of all kinds, all over the world. Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, everywhere, because that's what the US owns. That's the US domain. And that's the way it goes to that's what the Cold War was about. You simply take a look at the events. That's the way you find out what it was about. Now, actually, the United States is a very open society, uniquely so. So we have an enormous access to internal records, much beyond any other country. And they explain it. They explain exactly what they're doing in the internal documents. The major driving force in American policy right through this period has been to block independent nationalism. That's explicit, straightforward. You have to block independent nationalism, which seeks to use resources of a country for the benefit of the people of that country. They have to be integrated into a global system in which their resources are available to Western, meaning mostly US investors, and they have to conform to US policy decisions. Anything that's not that is called radical nationalism, and that has to be suppressed. And there's terminology for it. So Henry Kissinger, for example, said the main problem we face is what he called of viruses that might spread contagion. He was speaking specifically about Chile, Allende's Chile. He said that's a virus that might spread contagion. The contagion was the threat of a parliamentary road to social democracy. That's dangerous. That might spread, and we got to stop it. Well, what do you do when you have a virus that might spread contagion? You destroy the virus, and you inoculate the victims, the potential targets. How do you do that? You destroy the country that's the target, like Chile, impose a military dictatorship, and protect the surrounding region by instituting murderous national security states, kind of neo-Nazi national security states. That's exactly what was done in the case of Latin America. It was done in Southeast Asia. It's done systematically. And that's the core of the Cold War on the Western side, meaning most of the world. On the Russian side, you're familiar with it, much smaller operations of it, much smaller on a similar kind. Those are the events of the Cold War, and that's the logic of the Cold War. And that's exactly why it continued as soon as Russia disappeared, without any change. So just to give you one more piece of evidence which you can look at, of course, as soon as the USSR collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, the United States, the Bush administration, produced a new national security strategy and a new defense budget applied to the new situation. And it's very interesting reading. It's also very interesting that historians don't look at it. Try to see if you can find some coverage of it. But you can look at it. It's public. And here's what it said, basically. It said we still have to maintain a massive military system, and not because of the Russians, they're gone, but because of the technological sophistication of third world countries. Literally, if you're a well-trained intellectual, you don't laugh, and nobody laughed. But because of the technological sophistication of the third world, we have to maintain this huge, overwhelming military system, 1,000 military bases all over the world and so on. We have to maintain what was called the defense industrial base. Anyone who knows anything about the economy in the United States, and in fact Europe, knows that what's called a free enterprise economy is actually very heavily based on the dynamic state sector. That's where most of the research and development get done at taxpayer expense. It's finally, if anything works out, it's handed over to private enterprise. That's computers, internet, whole IT revolution, pharmaceuticals, just about everything works like that. That's called the defense industrial base. So we have to maintain that. Taxpayer has to keep funding the potential profits of private enterprise. The most interesting part was about the Middle East. It said we have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East. And then comes an interesting phrase, aimed at the Middle East, where the serious problems we faced could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. In other words, the Russians weren't responsible for them. So in short, we've been lying to you for 50 years. It's not the Russians. It's radical nationalism, which is what they went on to say. That's what it's been all along. That's what it is now. That's the Cold War. Continues as before. Now it's at the borders of, right at the borders of Russia.